I'm Rebecca, 29. And this is the story of how I became my family's favorite target hand. What happened when I finally stopped being their punching bag. For as long as I can remember, I was the problem child in my family. Not because I was rebellious or difficult, but because somehow, every single thing that went wrong in our household became my fault. When my parents fought about money, it was because I was expensive to raise. When my younger brother got caught smoking weed behind the garage, it was because I was a bad influence. When my older sister dropped out of college for the third time, it was because my academic success made her feel inadequate and pressured. I spent 29 years trying to figure out what I had done wrong to deserve this treatment. I was the daughter who helped with groceries without being asked. I was the one who remembered everyone's birthdays and made sure cards were sent. I paid my own way through college, never asked for money, and even helped my parents with their mortgage payments when my father was between jobs. I was reliable, responsible, and genuinely caring toward my family members. Yet somehow, I remained the root of every problem, the source of every conflict, and the reason behind every failure that touched our family tree. Before I go deeper into my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. If you've ever stood your ground when someone failed to see your worth, feel free to let me know below. And if these kinds of stories speak to you, you're welcome to follow the channel for more. The pattern started early. I remember being 8 years old when my parents separated for 6 months. While they were working through their marriage counseling, I was told by my mother that their problems began because I was such a demanding baby, and that the stress of raising me had driven a wedge between them. I carried that guilt for years, believing that my very existence had somehow damaged the people I loved most. As I grew older, the blame only intensified. When my brother started getting into trouble at school, my parents convinced themselves it was because he was trying to rebel against having a perfect older sister. They never considered that maybe he was acting out because of their constant fighting, or because they rarely paid attention to him unless he was in trouble. Instead, they told me I needed to tone down my achievements so he wouldn't feel so inadequate, so I did. I stopped mentioning my good grades. I downplayed my acceptance into honor society. I never talked about my job promotions or the praise I received from supervisors. I learned to make myself smaller, thinking that maybe if I dimmed my light, everyone else would stop feeling so threatened by it, but it didn't work. The blame just shifted to new territories. When my sister struggled with her relationships, it was because I made commitment look too easy with my long-term boyfriend. When my father's business struggled, it was because the family stress I caused prevented him from focusing on his work. When my mother developed anxiety, it was because worrying about me and my effect on the family kept her up at night. I became the family's emotional dumping ground. Every frustration, every disappointment, every unmet expectation somehow traced back to me. I was simultaneously too successful and not successful enough, too independent and not supportive enough, too present and not present enough. I existed in a constant state of contradiction, trying desperately to solve problems I hadn't created while being blamed for everything I couldn't fix. The most painful part wasn't even the blame itself, was the isolation that came with it. During family gatherings, I could feel the undercurrent of resentment. Conversations would halt when I entered a room. My achievements were met with polite smiles that never reached anyone's eyes. My struggles were dismissed as deserved or character building. I felt like a stranger in my own family, tolerated but never truly welcomed. I spent years in therapy trying to understand what was wrong with me. I read self-help books, attended workshops on family dynamics, and constantly examined my own behavior for signs of the toxicity everyone seemed to see in me. I apologized for things I hadn't done and took responsibility for problems that existed long before I was born. What I didn't realize then was that I wasn't the problem, I was the solution to everyone else's problems. I was the convenient target that allowed my family members to avoid looking at their own choices, their own patterns, and their own responsibility for the chaos in their lives. As long as they could point to me as the source of all dysfunction, they never had to examine the real issues tearing our family apart. This realization would come later though. For now, I was still trapped in the exhausting cycle of trying to prove my worth to people who had already decided I was worthless. The weight of carrying everyone else's failures became heavier with each passing year. Every phone call from home brought a new crisis that somehow traced back to my influence, my choices, or my very existence. I started to dread seeing my family's names pop up on my phone screen because I knew it meant another problem had been laid at my feet. My brother. Jake's descent into drug addiction became the most painful example of how twisted the family blame game had become. When he was first caught with marijuana at 16, my parents sat me down for a serious conversation about my role in his behavior. According to them, Jake had started experimenting with drugs because he felt overshadowed by my academic success and needed something to make him feel special. They explained that my achievements had created an impossible standard for him to live up to, and drugs were his way of rebelling against the pressure I had inadvertently created. I remember sitting in that living room, stunned, as they outlined how my good grades and scholarship offers were somehow responsible for my brother's poor choices. They never mentioned that Jake had been struggling with anger issues since childhood, or that he had started hanging out with kids known for getting into trouble. They never acknowledged that maybe their own inconsistent parenting, praising him one day and ignoring him the next, might have contributed to his need for external validation and escape. Instead, they asked me to have a conversation with Jake about how sorry I was for making him feel inferior. They wanted me to apologize for succeeding, for working hard, for being responsible, and I did it. I actually sat down with my 17-year-old brother and apologized for being a good student, as if my dedication to my education was a personal attack on his character. But Jake's problems only escalated. By the time he was 20, he had moved from marijuana to harder substances. He was stealing money from our parents, disappearing for days at a time, and showing up at family events either high or looking for money to get high. Yet somehow, this progression was still my fault. My mother would call me in tears, explaining that Jake's addiction had gotten worse because I wasn't around enough to be a positive influence on him. The logic was first, I was blamed for his drug use because my success made him feel bad about himself. Then, I was blamed for the worsening of his addiction because I wasn't present enough to counteract the negative influences in his life. I was simultaneously too much and not enough, too successful and not supportive enough. My parents' marriage troubles followed a similar pattern of misplaced blame. When they finally divorced after 25 years of marriage, I became the scapegoat for their failed relationship. According to my mother, the stress of raising a child who caused so much family tension had worn down their marriage over the years. She painted a picture of two parents who had been so exhausted from managing the problems I created that they had no energy left for their own relationship. This narrative was particularly devastating because I had watched their marriage deteriorate with my own eyes, and I knew the real reasons had nothing to do with me. My father had always been emotionally unavailable, burying himself in work to avoid dealing with family issues. My mother had developed a pattern of passive-aggressive communication that made every conversation feel like walking through a minefield. They had fundamental differences in how they handled money, parenting, and life goals that had created tension long before any of their children were old enough to cause real problems. But acknowledging these underlying issues would have required them to take responsibility for their own choices and patterns. It was much easier to point to me as the source of the stress that had supposedly torn them apart. During their divorce proceedings, I was even asked to write a letter to the mediator explaining how sorry I was for the role I had played in their marital breakdown. I was 26 years old, and I was being asked to apologize for somehow destroying a marriage I had nothing to do with creating. My sister Emma's career struggles became another weight added to my shoulders. Emma had always been creative and artistic, but she struggled with consistency and follow-through. She would start projects with enormous enthusiasm and then abandon them when they required sustained effort or when she encountered obstacles. She had dropped out of 3 different college programs, quit countless jobs, and moved back in with our parents multiple times throughout her 20s. Rather than addressing Emma's pattern of starting things she couldn't finish, my family decided that her struggles were caused by her feeling overshadowed by my professional success. They explained that watching me advance in my career made Emma feel like a failure, which caused her to give up on her own pursuits. My promotions at work became sources of family tension because they supposedly made Emma feel inadequate. My decision to buy my own home was seen as showing off and making Emma feel bad about still living with our parents. I found myself downplaying every achievement, every piece of good news, every step forward in my life because I was told it was hurting my sister's self-esteem. When I got engaged to my long-term boyfriend, I was asked to keep the news quiet because Emma was going through another breakup and my happiness would make her feel worse about her own love life. When I received a promotion that came with a significant salary increase, I was lectured about being more sensitive to Emma's financial struggles, the emotional toll of constantly managing everyone else's feelings while suppressing my own achievements became overwhelming. I developed chronic anxiety, constantly second-guessing every decision and wondering how it might negatively impact my family members. I started therapy to deal with what I thought was my inability to maintain healthy relationships, convinced that there must be something fundamentally wrong with my personality that made me so difficult for my family to be around. I internalized every criticism, every blame, every suggestion that I was the source of our family's dysfunction. I began to see myself through their eyes as someone who was inherently problematic, someone whose very existence seemed to create chaos and pain for the people I loved most. I carried the weight of their unresolved trauma, their unmet expectations, and their inability to take responsibility for their own choices. What I didn't understand then was that I wasn't carrying the weight of their problems, I was carrying the weight of their refusal to acknowledge that their problems existed independent of me. I had become the family's emotional garbage disposal, processing all of their dysfunction while they remained free to avoid looking at the real sources of their pain and disappointment. The breaking point came on a Sunday afternoon in October, during what was supposed to be a celebration of my grandmother's 82nd birthday. The entire extended family had gathered at my aunt's house. Cousins, uncles, aunts, and family friends who had known us for decades. I had been looking forward to the gathering because my grandmother had always been one of the few family members who seemed to genuinely appreciate me for who I was. What I didn't expect was to become the main course of family drama, served up for public consumption in front of people I had known since childhood. The ambush began subtly, as these things often do. My mother started by making seemingly innocent comments about how busy I had been lately, emphasizing the word in a way that suggested my busyness was selfish rather than productive. She mentioned to my great-aunt how I had been too occupied with work to spend as much time with family as I should. The tone was set. I was being painted as the self-absorbed family member who had lost sight of what really mattered. My grandmother had been experiencing some health issues over the past year. At 82, she was dealing with arthritis, high blood pressure, and the general fatigue that comes with aging. She had been struggling with grocery shopping and getting to medical appointments, challenges that are perfectly normal for someone her age. What wasn't normal was how my family had decided to handle her needs. Despite living 20 minutes away from my grandmother, while most of my other family members lived within 5 minutes of her, I had been the one coordinating her medical care. I was the one who had researched doctors, scheduled appointments, and arranged for transportation when she couldn't drive herself. I had been doing her grocery shopping every other week, picking up prescriptions, and checking in on her regularly by phone. I had even arranged for a cleaning service to come to her house twice a month because I noticed she was struggling to maintain her home the way she used to. But none of this mattered when my uncle decided to make me the villain of my grandmother's story. "You know, Rebecca," he said loudly enough for the entire room to hear, "Grandma has been really struggling lately. And I think part of the problem is that she feels abandoned by some of her grandchildren." He looked directly at me as he said this, making it clear who he was talking about. "She's been telling us how lonely she gets, especially when certain people are too busy with their own lives to visit." I felt my face flush as every conversation in the room seemed to pause. Extended family members who had been chatting about other topics suddenly turned their attention to what was clearly about to become a public confrontation. My grandmother herself looked uncomfortable, shaking her head slightly as if to discourage what was happening. But my uncle continued. "I mean, we all understand that some people have demanding careers," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But family should come first. Grandma raised us to understand that, but I guess some people missed that lesson." My mother jumped in to support her brother's attack. "Rebecca, you know your grandmother has been asking about you. She mentions every time we talk to her that she hasn't seen you in weeks. It's really affecting her health. This feeling like her own granddaughter doesn't care enough to visit." The accusation was so fundamentally untrue that I initially couldn't even process it. I had visited my grandmother just 4 days earlier. I had taken her to a doctor's appointment on Tuesday and had lunch with her afterward. I had called her twice since then to check how she was feeling after the appointment. The idea that I was neglecting her was not just wrong, it was the complete opposite of reality. But the family narrative had already been established, and facts weren't going to interfere with the story they wanted to tell. My sister Emma, who hadn't visited our grandmother in over a month, nodded sympathetically at my mother's words. My brother Jake, who was currently too unreliable due to his addiction issues to be trusted with any family responsibilities, looked at me with disappointment. As if I had personally let him down. "I don't understand where this is coming from," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the humiliation of being attacked in front of the entire extended family. "I just took Grandma to Dr. Peterson's office on Tuesday. I do her grocery shopping every other week. I arranged for her cleaning service and her prescription deliveries." My aunt, who had been silent up to this point, decided to join the pylon. "Well, visiting for medical appointments isn't the same as spending quality time with her, Rebecca. She needs emotional support, not just practical help. She needs to feel loved and valued, not like a chore on your to-do list." The irony was staggering. Here was my aunt, who lived 3 minutes from my grandmother and saw her maybe once a month, lecturing me about emotional support. Here was my uncle, who called our grandmother only when he needed something, talking about family values. Here were my siblings, who treated our grandmother like a convenient source of birthday money and holiday gifts, acting like I was the neglectful one. But the most painful part wasn't the false accusations, it was watching how eagerly everyone participated in tearing me down. Extended family members who had known me since I was a child nodded along with the criticisms. Cousins, who had always seemed to like me, looked at me with newfound judgment. I could see them mentally revising their opinions of me, accepting this narrative that I was selfish and uncaring. My grandmother finally spoke up, her voice shaky but firm. "Now wait just a minute," she said. "Rebecca has been wonderful to me. She's been taking care of things that the rest of you, but my mother, cut her off." "Mom, you don't need to protect Rebecca's feelings. We're trying to help her understand how her behavior affects other people. This is exactly the pattern we've been dealing with for years. Rebecca puts herself first and then can't understand why people get hurt." That was the moment something inside me snapped. Not because of the false accusations about my grandmother, but because I suddenly saw the bigger picture with crystal clarity. This wasn't really about my grandmother's health, or my visitation frequency. This was about my family's need to have a villain in every story, and I had been cast in that role so consistently that they couldn't see me as anything else. Even when I was the one actually helping, actually showing up, actually taking responsibility, I was still the problem. Even when other family members were absent, unreliable, or genuinely neglectful, I was still the one who needed to be corrected and criticized. The narrative of my selfishness had become so entrenched that reality couldn't penetrate it. I looked around the room at faces I had known my entire life, people who had watched me grow up, who had seen me graduate, who had celebrated my achievements when I was younger. But now all I saw was a room full of people who had decided that I was fundamentally flawed, and no amount of evidence to the contrary would change their minds. "You know what?" I said, standing up from the couch where I had been sitting next to my grandmother. "You're absolutely right. I have been selfish. I've been selfish with my time, my energy, and my care, giving it all to people who don't appreciate it and don't deserve it." I kissed my grandmother on the forehead and whispered, "I love you, and I'll call you tomorrow." Then I walked out of that house, knowing that something fundamental had shifted inside me. I was done being their scapegoat. I was done trying to prove my worth to people who had already decided I was worthless. I was done being the villain in their story, especially when that story was fiction. Word count, 1,000 words. The drive home from my grandmother's birthday party felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, and I had to pull over twice because tears were blurring my vision. But somewhere between the humiliation I had just endured and the sanctuary of my own apartment, something crystallized in my mind with startling clarity. I was done. Not just done with that particular confrontation, but done with the entire dynamic that had defined my relationship with my family for 29 years. Done with being the designated problem. Done with apologizing for existing. Done with trying to earn love from people who had already decided I wasn't worthy of it. For the first time in my adult life, I made a decision that was purely about protecting myself rather than managing everyone else's emotions. I was going to disappear from their lives completely, at least for a while, and see what happened when they no longer had me to blame for everything that went wrong. The decision felt both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because I had never prioritized my own well-being over my family's dysfunction. Liberating because I finally understood that their dysfunction wasn't my responsibility to fix. That night, I sat on my couch with my phone in my hands, staring at the contact list that represented 2 decades of family drama. My mother's number, which had delivered countless calls about crises I needed to solve. My father's number, which primarily activated when he needed me to mediate between him and my siblings. Jake's number, which mostly resulted in requests for money or lectures about how I wasn't supportive enough of his recovery. Emma's number, which connected me to an endless stream of complaints about how my success made her feel inadequate. One by one, I blocked them all. The act of pressing block contact felt like a physical release, as if I was literally cutting invisible chains that had been binding me to their chaos. With each number I blocked, I could feel a weight lifting from my shoulders, a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying until it was gone. But blocking their numbers was just the beginning. Over the next few days, I had to make dozens of smaller decisions that reinforced my commitment to stepping away. When my aunt called to invite me to a family barbecue the following weekend, I declined politely but firmly. When my cousin texted asking if I was okay because my mother had been worried about me, I responded that I was fine but needed some space from family drama. The hardest part wasn't the big, dramatic gesture of walking away, it was breaking the countless small habits that had trained me to prioritize their needs over my own peace. For years, I had been conditioned to drop everything when family members called with problems. I had canceled plans, rearranged work schedules, and sacrificed my own time and energy because I believed that being family meant making myself available to fix whatever crisis had emerged. Breaking that pattern required constant vigilance. When my phone rang and I saw an unknown number that I suspected might be a family member calling from someone else's phone, I had to resist the urge to answer. When I found myself worrying about whether Jake was staying clean or whether Emma had figured out her career situation, I had to actively redirect my thoughts toward my own life and goals. The guilt was overwhelming at first. I had been trained since childhood to believe that putting myself first was selfish, that prioritizing my own mental health over family harmony was a moral failing. I caught myself making mental lists of reasons why I should reach out, should apologize, should try to fix whatever damage my absence might be causing. But then I would remember the look on my grandmother's face when she tried to defend me, only to be silenced by my mother's interruption. I would remember the feeling of sitting in that room full of people who had known me my entire life, all of them nodding along as I was painted as selfish and uncaring, despite being the only one actually helping my grandmother. Those memories strengthened my resolve. I wasn't being selfish, I was finally being self-preserving. There's a difference between caring for yourself and being narcissistic, just like there's a difference between being supportive and being a doormat. I started filling the space that family drama had occupied in my life with activities that actually brought me joy and peace. I signed up for a pottery class I had been putting off for months. I started reading fiction again, something I had abandoned because I was always too stressed from family issues to concentrate on stories that weren't crises. I began taking long walks in the evenings, something I couldn't do before because I was always on standby for family emergency phone calls. Most importantly, I started sleeping through the night for the first time in years. The constant low anxiety that had become my baseline, always waiting for the next family crisis, always prepared to be blamed for the next problem, began to fade. I didn't realize how exhausted I had been from carrying everyone else's emotional baggage until I finally set it down. The silence from my family was initially deafening. After years of constant contact, constant drama, constant demands for my attention and energy, the quiet felt almost surreal. But as days passed without crisis calls or blame sessions, I began to appreciate the peace. I was learning, for the first time in my adult life, what it felt like to live in my own life rather than constantly managing everyone else's. I was discovering who I was when I wasn't defined by my role as the family scapegoat, the designated problem solver, the convenient target for everyone else's frustrations. It felt like coming home to myself. The first week of silence was the hardest. I would wake up in the morning and instinctively reach for my phone, expecting to see the usual barrage of family crisis texts that had become my daily routine. When the screen showed nothing but work emails and messages from actual friends, I felt a strange combination of relief and panic. Relief that I wouldn't have to start my day managing someone else's drama, but panic that maybe something terrible had happened and I wasn't there to help. The conditioning ran so deep that I found myself checking the local news websites, worried that my absence might have somehow contributed to a family emergency I should have prevented. It took several days for me to recognize how twisted this thinking was. I had been so trained to believe I was responsible for everyone else's well-being that I couldn't imagine them surviving without my constant intervention. But as the days passed without any catastrophic news, something unexpected began to happen. The knot of anxiety that had lived in my chest for as long as I could remember started to loosen. I realized that the low-level stress I had accepted as normal wasn't normal at all. It was the result of living in a constant state of emergency preparedness for other people's problems. By the second week, I made a decision that felt both overdue and revolutionary. I called a therapist. I had been in therapy briefly in my early 20s, but I had approached it then as a way to fix whatever was wrong with me that made my family relationships so difficult. This time, I approached therapy with a different question. Not how can I be better for them, but how can I be better for me? Dr. Martinez was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a direct communication style that I found immediately comforting. During our first session, I explained my family situation and my decision to step away. I expected her to suggest ways I could repair the relationships or help me understand my role in the family dysfunction. Instead, she asked me a question that stopped me in my tracks. "Rebecca," she said, "when was the last time you made a decision, based purely on what you wanted, without considering how it might affect your family's opinion of you?" I sat in her office for a full minute, searching my memory for an answer. The silence stretched between us as I realized I couldn't remember a single significant life choice I had made without filtering it through the lens of family reaction, my college major, my career path, my living situation. Even my relationship choices, all of them, had been influenced by my desire to either please my family or avoid giving them another reason to criticize me. "I don't think I ever have," I finally admitted. And saying it out loud felt like confessing to a crime I hadn't realized I was committing. Therapy became a weekly anchor in my new life structure. Dr. Martinez helped me understand concepts I had never encountered before, like enmeshment and scapegoating. She explained that healthy families don't require one member to absorb all the blame for the system's dysfunction. She helped me see that my hyperresponsivity wasn't a virtue, it was a trauma response that had developed to help me survive in an emotionally unsafe environment. As I began to understand the dynamics that had shaped my entire adult life, I also started reconnecting with parts of myself that I had abandoned in my effort to be the perfect family member. I reached out to friends I had lost touch with over the years. Relationships that had faded because I was always too consumed with family drama to maintain them properly. My friend Sarah from college responded to my text within hours, and we met for coffee that weekend. As I explained what I had been going through with my family, her reaction surprised me. Instead of the judgment or advice I expected, she looked genuinely angry on my behalf. "Rebecca, I remember you in college," she said. "You were always getting phone calls from home about some crisis or another. We used to joke that you were like a volunteer firefighter for your family's emotional emergencies. But it wasn't funny, you were stressed all the time. I always wondered why you let them dump all their problems on you." Hearing this perspective from someone who had known me during a formative time in my life was revelatory. Sarah reminded me of aspects of my personality that I had forgotten: my sense of humor, my creativity, my ability to be spontaneous. She recalled weekend trips we had taken, late-night conversations about books and dreams, moments of lightness that had been completely absent from my life in recent years. I realized that somewhere along the way, I had become a one-dimensional version of myself, the family problem solver, the designated caretaker, the reliable crisis manager. All the other parts of my personality, the parts that made me interesting and fun to be around, had been sacrificed to maintain my role in the family system. As I continued to reconnect with old friends and make new ones, I was struck by how differently these relationships functioned. When friends called, it was because they wanted to talk to me, not because they needed me to fix something. When I shared good news, they celebrated with me instead of finding ways to diminish my achievements. When I was going through difficult times, they offered support without making me feel guilty for needing help. These healthy relationships highlighted just how toxic my family dynamics had become. I began to understand that love isn't supposed to feel like a constant audition where you have to prove your worth through service and sacrifice. Real love doesn't require you to make yourself smaller so that others can feel bigger. I also started exploring interests that I had put on the back burner for years. I joined a book club at the local library, something I had always wanted to do but never had time for because I was too busy managing family crises. I signed up for a weekend photography workshop, rediscovering a passion I had abandoned in college. I started cooking elaborate meals for myself, taking pleasure in the process instead of rushing through it. To get to the next family emergency, the mental and emotional energy that had been consumed by family drama was enormous, far more than I had realized while I was living in it, without the constant drain of managing other people's problems and emotions. I found myself with reserves of creativity and enthusiasm that I had forgotten I possessed. I was sleeping better, eating better, and feeling more like myself than I had in years. The chronic anxiety that I had accepted as a normal part of adult life began to fade. The tight feeling in my chest when my phone rang disappeared. The mental checklist of family members' problems that used to run constantly in the background of my mind finally went quiet. For the first time in my adult life, I was living in my own life instead of serving as a supporting character in everyone else's drama. The peace was intoxicating, and it made me realize just how much of myself I had been sacrificing to maintain relationships with people who had never truly valued what I was giving them. 3 weeks into my self-imposed exile from family drama, I began hearing whispers through mutual friends and extended family members about what was happening in my absence. The picture that emerged was both validating and heartbreaking. Validating because it proved how much I had actually been doing for my family, and heartbreaking because it showed how little they had valued my contributions until they were gone. The first cracks in their system became apparent through my grandmother, who had my new phone number and was the only family member I was still speaking with regularly. During one of our weekly calls, she mentioned that Jake had been struggling more than usual and that my parents seemed overwhelmed by his situation. When I gently pressed for details, the full scope of what had been happening began to emerge. Without me serving as Jake's unofficial case manager, his addiction recovery had completely derailed. For months, I had been the one calling him regularly to check on his sobriety, the one who knew which friends were bad influences and which were supportive of his recovery. I had been monitoring his behavior for warning signs of relapse, coordinating with his sponsor when he missed meetings, and serving as a buffer between him and our parents when tensions escalated. My parents had never fully understood the day-to-day work that addiction recovery required. They saw Jake's good days and bad days, but they didn't understand the patterns, the triggers, or the early warning signs that I had learned to recognize. Without me translating Jake's behavior and providing guidance on how to respond, they were completely unprepared to handle his relapse. According to my grandmother, Jake had been missing work regularly, had stopped attending his recovery meetings, and had been asking family members for money with increasingly desperate and creative stories about why he needed it. My parents, who had relied on me to tell them when to be firm and when to be supportive, were alternating between enabling his addiction and cutting him off completely, both approaches that made his situation worse. The breaking point came when Jake stole money from my grandmother's purse during a visit. In the past, I would have been the one to handle this situation. I would have confronted Jake privately, helped him understand the consequences of his actions, and worked with the family to establish boundaries that protected my grandmother, while still supporting Jake's recovery. Without me there to manage the crisis, it exploded into a family-wide conflict that ended with Jake storming out and not speaking to anyone for a week. My parents' financial situation was also deteriorating rapidly without my quiet support. For years, I had been helping them with their mortgage payments during my father's seasonal employment gaps. I had never made a big deal about this assistance. I would simply transfer money to their account with a casual text about helping out a little this month. They had grown so accustomed to this safety net that they had structured their budget around my contributions without even consciously acknowledging them. Without my financial backup, they were facing their first real mortgage crisis in years. My father's work had slowed down during the winter months, as it always did, but this time there was no mysterious extra money appearing in their account to cover the shortfall. They were forced to confront the reality that their lifestyle had been subsidized by the daughter they constantly criticized for being selfish and self-centered. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same parents who had blamed me for their marital problems and accused me of not caring enough about family were now struggling to pay their bills because I had been quietly supporting them all along. They had been so focused on everything I was supposedly doing wrong that they had never acknowledged everything I was actually doing right. My grandmother mentioned that my parents had been stressed about money and that she had offered to help, but her fixed income couldn't cover the gap that my contributions had been filling. The stress was apparently affecting my father's job performance, creating a cycle where financial worry was making it harder for him to work effectively, which in turn created more financial pressure. Emma's situation was perhaps the most revealing of all. Without me serving as her emotional dumping ground and constant source of reassurance, she was forced to confront her career problems without a convenient scapegoat to blame them on. For years, she had used me as both a target for her frustrations, and a measuring stick that made her feel inadequate. Every conversation we had involved her complaining about her work situation and then finding ways to blame her struggles on my success, making her feel bad about herself. Without me available to absorb her complaints and validate her victim narrative, Emma was apparently having a difficult time maintaining her job performance. According to family gossip, she had been missing deadlines, calling in sick frequently, and had received a formal warning from her supervisor about her work quality. For the first time, she couldn't blame her professional struggles on feeling overshadowed by my achievements. She had to face the reality that her work problems were the result of her own choices and patterns. The most telling aspect of Emma's deterioration was how lost she seemed without our regular conversations where I would listen to her complaints and offer encouragement. She had become so dependent on using me as an emotional crutch that she didn't know how to process her frustrations without our weekly venting sessions. She had never developed healthy coping mechanisms for dealing with workplace stress, because she had always been able to transfer her negative emotions to me. My cousin Lisa, who lived nearby and occasionally socialized with my family, filled me in on some of the more dramatic developments during a casual phone call. She mentioned that there had been several family meetings at my parents' house where they discussed the Rebecca situation, as if my decision to prioritize my mental health was a problem that required a family solution. These meetings apparently devolved into arguments about who was responsible for the various crises that were emerging. Without me present to absorb the blame, family members were forced to point fingers at each other, creating conflicts that had been suppressed for years. My father blamed my mother for not managing Jake's recovery properly. My mother blamed my father for their financial problems. Emma blamed both parents for not providing enough emotional support during her work struggles. The family system that had functioned smoothly when I was serving as the designated problem absorber was falling apart without their convenient scapegoat. They were discovering what I had known for years, that their problems existed independent of me, and that blaming me for everything had been a way to avoid taking responsibility for their own dysfunction. Perhaps most significantly, they were beginning to realize how much actual work I had been doing behind the scenes to keep their lives functioning. My grandmother mentioned that my mother had asked her if she knew exactly what Rebecca had been doing to help Jake, because they were struggling to figure out how to manage his recovery without my involvement. My father had apparently made several comments about missing the extra help with expenses, without directly acknowledging that the help had been coming from me. The most painful part of hearing about their struggles wasn't satisfaction at their difficulties, it was grief for the years I had spent providing support that was never acknowledged or appreciated. I had been working so hard to help them succeed, to keep their lives stable, to protect them from the consequences of their own choices, and they had never even recognized the extent of my contributions. I realized that I hadn't just been serving as their scapegoat, I had been serving as their safety net, their crisis manager, their financial backup, and their emotional support system. I had been doing the work of multiple family members while being blamed for the problems I was actually solving. Watching their system crumble in my absence was like seeing the true architecture of our family dynamics for the first time. Without me there to absorb blame and provide support, they were forced to confront the reality that I hadn't been the source of their problems. I had been the solution to them. The question now was whether they would recognize this truth or find new ways to make my absence my fault too. Exactly 1 month after I had walked out of my grandmother's birthday party, my phone started ringing again. But these weren't the blocked numbers I had silenced, these were calls from relatives I barely spoke to, family, friends, and even my grandmother's neighbors. My family had launched a coordinated campaign to reach me, and they were using every possible connection to bypass the boundaries I had established. The first call came from my cousin Mike, someone I had maybe spoken to 5 times in the past decade. His tone was casual, as if he was just checking in. But within minutes, he launched into a speech about how everyone was worried about me, and how my sudden disappearance was causing unnecessary drama. He suggested that whatever had happened at the birthday party could probably be worked out if I would just be willing to have a mature conversation with my parents. The word mature struck me as particularly ironic, considering that I was the one who had removed myself from a toxic situation rather than continuing to participate in it. But Mike's message was clear. My absence was being framed as the childish response of someone who couldn't handle normal family conflict. Over the next few days, the calls and messages escalated in both frequency and desperation. My aunt left a voicemail explaining that Jake had been really struggling, and that my parents were at their wits' end trying to help him. She didn't ask how I was doing or acknowledge that I might have legitimate reasons for stepping away. Instead, she focused entirely on how my absence was affecting everyone else. As if my well-being was irrelevant compared to their convenience. Emma managed to get my new number somehow and sent a series of increasingly frantic text messages. The first few were attempts at emotional manipulation. With messages like, "I don't understand why you're punishing the whole family for whatever Mom and Dad did, and your nephew keeps asking where Aunt Rebecca is and I don't know what to tell him." When those didn't work, she moved to direct attacks. "This silent treatment thing is really immature, Rebecca. We all have problems, but we don't just abandon our families because our feelings got hurt." The messages revealed so much about how they viewed the situation. In their minds, I hadn't made a healthy decision to protect myself from ongoing emotional abuse. I was throwing a tantrum that needed to be managed. They couldn't conceive that my absence might be a permanent boundary rather than a temporary punishment designed to get their attention. But the most telling aspect of all these communications was what they didn't contain. Not a single message included an apology for the birthday party incident. Not one person acknowledged that maybe they had treated me unfairly or that I might have legitimate grievances. Instead, every communication focused on how my absence was inconvenient for them and how I needed to return to fix the problems that were emerging without my constant intervention. The breakthrough moment came when my father left a voicemail that perfectly encapsulated their perspective. His voice was tired and frustrated as he said, "Rebecca, I don't know what's gotten into you, but this has gone on long enough. Your brother is in real trouble, your mother is stressed out beyond belief, and frankly, we need you to stop being so dramatic and come home to help us figure this out. Whatever you're upset about, we can talk about it later, but right now, your family needs you." The message was revelatory in its complete self-centeredness. My father was essentially saying that my feelings and needs were less important than their crises, and that I should set aside my own well-being to return to my role as the family problem solver. The phrase "stop being so dramatic" was particularly telling. It dismissed my legitimate decision to protect my mental health as theatrical attention-seeking, but nothing prepared me for what happened the following weekend. I was enjoying a quiet Saturday morning, reading in my apartment with coffee and classical music, when someone started pounding on my door. When I looked through the peephole, I saw my mother standing in the hallway, her face set with the determined expression I remembered from childhood when she had decided to have a serious talk with me about my behavior. I almost didn't open the door. The peace I had found over the past month felt precious and fragile, and I knew that letting her into my space would shatter it. But I also knew that if I didn't face this confrontation now, she would keep coming back until I did. When I opened the door, she pushed past me into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk," she announced, looking around my living room as if she was inspecting it for evidence of whatever had caused my breakdown. She had already decided that my absence was the result of some kind of mental health crisis, rather than a rational response to years of mistreatment. "Mom, you can't just show up at my apartment unannounced," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the adrenaline surge that her presence had triggered. "I can when my daughter disappears for a month without explanation and refuses to answer anyone's calls," she replied, settling herself on my couch as if she owned the space. "Do you have any idea what you've put us through? Your father is beside himself, your brother is spiraling, and your sister is barely holding it together at work. This selfish phase you're going through needs to end right now." The word selfish hung in the air between us like a weapon she had deliberately chosen to wound me with. After everything that had happened, after all the support I had provided over the years, she was still framing my self-preservation as selfishness. "Mom," I said, sitting down across from her but maintaining distance, "do you even remember what happened at Grandma's birthday party? Do you remember how you and Uncle Dave attacked me in front of the entire family? Do you remember accusing me of neglecting Grandma when I'm the only one who actually helps her with her medical care?" She waved her hand dismissively. "That was just family discussion, Rebecca. You're always so sensitive about everything. We were concerned about your grandmother, and yes, maybe we could have approached it differently, but that's no reason to punish the entire family by disappearing." The casual dismissal of what had been a deeply humiliating experience was exactly what I had expected, but it still hit me like a physical blow. In her mind, being publicly attacked and falsely accused was just family discussion that I had overreacted to because of my excessive sensitivity. "This isn't punishment, Mom," I said. "This is me choosing not to participate in family dynamics that are harmful to my mental health." I'm not doing this to hurt anyone, I'm doing this to protect myself. She looked at me as if I had said something completely incomprehensible. Protect yourself from what? From people who love you. From a family that needs you. Rebecca, I raised you better than this. I raised you to understand that family comes first, that we support each other through difficult times. What you're doing right now is the opposite of everything I taught you about loyalty and commitment. The conversation continued for another hour, but it became clear that we were speaking completely different languages. Every time I tried to explain how their treatment had affected me, she reframed it as my misunderstanding of their good intentions. Every time I mentioned specific incidents of being blamed or scapegoated, she either dismissed them as my oversensitivity or claimed she didn't remember them that way. Most importantly, she never once asked how I was doing. She never inquired about my mental health, my happiness, or my life during the month I had been away. Her entire focus was on the inconvenience my absence had caused for other family members and the problems they needed me to return and solve. Your brother needs you right now, she said, playing what she clearly thought was her strongest card. He's been asking for you, Rebecca. He's struggling with his recovery, and you're the only one who really knows how to help him. Are you really going to let your hurt feelings get in the way of helping someone who might not survive without your support? The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity. She was trying to make me responsible for Jake's potential relapse, as if my decision to prioritize my own mental health could somehow cause his addiction to kill him. She was weaponizing my love for my brother against my need for self-preservation, trying to guilt me into returning to a role that had been destroying me for years. When it became clear that I wasn't going to be convinced to immediately return to the family fold, her tone shifted from pleading to angry. Fine, she said, standing up abruptly. If you want to be selfish and abandon your family when we need you most, that's your choice. But don't expect us to just sit around waiting for you to get over whatever this is. We're going to figure out how to manage without you, and when you finally come to your senses, don't be surprised if things have changed. The threat was clear. Return to your role as our problem solver, or risk being permanently excluded from the family. It was the ultimate manipulation, creating a false deadline to pressure me into making a decision based on fear rather than what was actually healthy for me. After she left, I sat in my apartment feeling like I had been hit by a truck. But underneath the emotional exhaustion, there was a strange sense of clarity. My mother's visit had confirmed everything I had suspected about their motivations. They didn't miss me as a person, they missed me as a function. They didn't want me back because they loved and valued me, they wanted me back because their system didn't work without someone to blame and someone to fix their problems. For the first time, I understood with absolute certainty that I wasn't dealing with people who were capable of seeing me as a complete human being with my own needs and feelings. I was dealing with people who saw me only as a tool for their convenience. And they were angry that their tool had stopped working. The revelation came in the most unexpected way, during what I thought was the end of my mother's guilt trip visit. She had been gathering her purse and coat, clearly frustrated that her manipulation tactics hadn't worked, when she made an offhand comment that changed everything I thought I understood about my family dynamics. You know, Rebecca, she said, pausing at my door with an exasperated sigh, we never thought you'd actually do something like this. You've always been so reliable, so capable of handling whatever life throws at you. We thought you were stronger than this. Something in her tone made me look up sharply. What do you mean, you never thought I'd do something like this? She seemed to realize she had said something she hadn't intended to, but it was too late to take it back. Her face flushed slightly as she tried to backtrack. I just mean, you've always been the stable one, the one who could deal with family problems without falling apart. We counted on that. Counted on what, exactly? I pressed, sensing that we were approaching something important. My mother shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing she could escape this conversation. But something about my direct question seemed to break down her usual filter. And what came out next shattered every assumption I had made about my family's treatment of me. Look, Rebecca, every family has someone who's just, better at handling stress. Someone who can take on more responsibility without it destroying them. You've always been that person for us. Your father and I, we're not as emotionally strong as you are. Jake has his addiction issues. Emma has always been more sensitive. You're the one who could handle whatever we needed you to handle. I stared at her, trying to process what she was actually saying. So you're telling me that you deliberately gave me more problems to deal with because you thought I could handle it better than everyone else? Not deliberately, she said quickly, but her eyes wouldn't meet mine. It's just ... When there's a crisis, you go to the person who can actually solve it. You go to the person who won't fall apart or make the situation worse. That's always been you. The pieces were clicking into place with horrifying clarity. Mom, are you saying that you and Dad have been using me as the family's problem solver because you decided I was stronger than everyone else? She looked genuinely confused by my tone, as if she couldn't understand why I was upset about what she clearly saw as a compliment. Rebecca, it's not using you. It's recognizing your strengths. You're good at fixing things, good at taking care of people. You're responsible and reliable in ways that your siblings just aren't. We've always been able to count on you. But what about when I needed support? I asked, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. What about when I was struggling or needed help? My mother actually looked surprised by the question. But you never really struggled, sweetheart. You always seemed to have everything under control. You got good grades, you found a good job, you managed your money well. You never seemed to need the kind of help that Jake and Emma needed. The casual dismissal of my emotional needs was breathtaking. In her mind, because I had developed coping skills and appeared competent on the surface, I didn't require the same level of care and attention that my siblings received. She had confused my ability to function despite stress with an absence of stress altogether. So when you blamed me for family problems, I said slowly, that was deliberate too. For the first time in the conversation, my mother looked genuinely uncomfortable. She sat back down on my couch, apparently realizing that this conversation was going to take longer than she had anticipated. It wasn't about blame. Exactly, she said, her voice taking on the careful tone she used when she knew she was on shaky ground. It's just that ... When you're the strongest person in the family, sometimes you have to be responsible for keeping everyone else stable. If Jake was acting out, you were the one who could influence him. If Emma was struggling with something, you were the one whose success might be affecting her. It wasn't about blame. It was about recognizing that your actions had more impact on the family than other people's actions did. I felt like I was hearing a foreign language that sounded like English but carried completely different meanings. Mom, do you hear what you're saying? You're telling me that you held me responsible for other people's choices because you decided I had more influence over them than they had over themselves. That's not. She started, then stopped, seeming to realize that she was digging herself deeper into a hole. Rebecca, you're twisting what I'm saying. We never meant to hurt you. We needed someone we could rely on. Your father and I, we're not perfect. We make mistakes. We get overwhelmed. But you always seemed to have answers, to know what to do. It was natural to turn to you when things got difficult. The word natural hung in the air like a revelation. She genuinely believed that it was natural and appropriate to designate one family member as the repository for everyone else's problems. She had convinced herself that my competence was an invitation for their dysfunction. And you never thought about how this might affect me? I asked. You never considered that maybe I was managing to seem stable because I was working twice as hard as everyone else to hold everything together? My mother looked genuinely puzzled. But you were good at it, Rebecca. You never complained. You never said you couldn't handle it. You just took care of things. We thought that's what you wanted to do. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. You thought I wanted to be the family crisis manager because I never told you to stop giving me crises to manage? Well, yes, she said, as if this was obvious. If you hadn't wanted to help, you would have said something. You would have told us to stop calling you when we had problems. You would have refused to get involved. I felt a laugh bubbling up from somewhere deep in my chest, not a happy laugh, but the kind of laughter that comes from recognizing something so absurd that crying would be inadequate. Mom, I was trained from childhood to believe that my worth depended on being helpful to my family. I was taught that saying no to family needs was selfish. How could I have told you to stop when you had convinced me that helping was my obligation? For the first time in our conversation, my mother looked genuinely uncertain. We never said you had to, ... You didn't have to say it explicitly, I interrupted. You said it every time you praised me for being responsible and criticized my siblings for being selfish. You said it every time you told me I was the strong one who could handle whatever you threw at me. You said it every time you made me feel guilty for having boundaries or needs of my own. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I had ever heard. My mother sat on my couch, apparently processing the implications of what she had revealed. For the first time, she seemed to understand that what she had framed as recognizing my strengths had actually been exploiting my conditioning. We never meant, she started, then stopped, seeming to realize that her intentions were irrelevant compared to the impact of her actions. I know you never meant to hurt me, I said quietly. But you did. And now I know it wasn't just dysfunctional, it was deliberate. You made conscious choices about how to distribute family responsibilities, and you chose to give me more than my fair share because you thought I could handle it. The truth was finally out. My family hadn't been unconsciously scapegoating me, they had been strategically using me. The silence after my mother's accidental confession stretched between us like a chasm that had always existed but was finally visible. I could see her mind working, trying to find a way to reframe what she had revealed, to spin it back into something that sounded reasonable and loving instead of manipulative and exploitative. But the truth was out now, and there was no putting it back. For the first time in my adult life, I felt completely clear about where I stood. The confusion that had plagued me for years, the constant self-doubt about whether I was being too sensitive, too dramatic, too selfish, evaporated in the face of this stark admission. My family had deliberately positioned me as their emotional caretaker because they found it convenient, not because they valued me as a person. Mom, I said, my voice steadier than I had expected it to be, I need you to understand something. I'm not coming back to that role. I'm not going to be the family's crisis manager anymore. And I'm not going to accept being blamed for problems I didn't create. She looked up at me sharply, apparently surprised by the firmness in my tone. Rebecca, I think you're overreacting to what I said. I was just trying to explain. You were explaining perfectly. I interrupted gently but firmly. You were explaining that my family has spent years using me as an emotional support system while giving me nothing in return. You were explaining that you've deliberately overloaded me with responsibilities because you decided I was strong enough to handle everyone else's problems on top of my own. My mother's face began to flush with the kind of anger I recognized from childhood, the anger that appeared whenever someone challenged the family's established order. That's not what I said, and you know it. I said we relied on you because you're capable and responsible. There's nothing wrong with families depending on each other. There's everything wrong with families depending on one person to solve everyone else's problems, I replied. Healthy families don't designate one member to absorb all the dysfunction and blame. Healthy families don't exploit one person's sense of obligation to avoid dealing with their own issues. She stood up abruptly, her posture shifting into the defensive stance I remembered from every argument we'd ever had. So what are you saying, Rebecca? That your family doesn't deserve your help? That we should all just figure out our problems on our own while you live your perfect little life without any responsibilities to the people who raised you? The manipulation in her words was so familiar that I almost fell back into my old pattern of apologizing and explaining myself. But something had fundamentally shifted in me during our conversation. I could see the manipulation for what it was now, a desperate attempt to guilt me back into a role that had been slowly destroying me for years. I'm saying that my help was never appreciated because it was expected, I said calmly. I'm saying that you turned my love for my family into a weapon against my own well-being. And I'm saying that I won't accept being treated as less than human anymore. Less than human, she repeated, her voice rising. How is being valued for your strengths being treated as less than human? How is being trusted with important family matters being devalued? Because my feelings never mattered, I said, the words coming out with a clarity that surprised me. Because my needs were never considered. Because when I was struggling, you told me I was strong enough to handle it alone. Because when I succeeded, you told me to hide my achievements so other people wouldn't feel bad. Because I was never allowed to be a whole person with my own problems and dreams and limitations. My mother stared at me as if I was speaking a foreign language. Everyone has limitations, Rebecca. Everyone has problems, but some people handle them better than others, and there's nothing wrong with acknowledging that. There's everything wrong with using that acknowledgement as an excuse to pile more problems onto someone who's already carrying too much, I replied. There's everything wrong with deciding that because someone appears strong, they don't need support or care or consideration. She shook her head vigorously, clearly frustrated by my refusal to accept her logic. You're making this much more complicated than it needs to be. Families help each other. That's what we do. If you don't want to help your family anymore, just say so. But don't try to make us the villains for expecting you to care about the people who love you. The casual reframing of exploitation as love was perhaps the most revealing part of our entire conversation. In her mind, using me as an emotional dumping ground was evidence of their affection, not their dysfunction. My refusal to continue in that role was proof of my selfishness, not my self-preservation. I do care about my family, I said quietly. I care enough to stop enabling the dysfunction that's been hurting all of us for years. I care enough to refuse to participate in a system that prevents anyone from growing, or healing, or taking responsibility for their own lives. So this is it? She asked, her voice taking on the cold tone that meant she was done trying to convince me and was moving into punishment mode. You're just going to abandon us. You're going to let your brother destroy himself and your sister struggle alone, and your parents figure everything out, without any help from the one person who's actually capable of helping. The threats were exactly what I had expected, but they didn't have the power over me that they once had. I could see them for what they were, last-ditch attempts to guilt me back into compliance by making me responsible for outcomes I couldn't control. I'm going to stop taking responsibility for problems that belong to other adults, I said. Jake's addiction is Jake's responsibility to manage, with appropriate professional help. Emma's career struggles are Emma's responsibility to address. Your financial problems are yours to solve. I'll be happy to have healthy relationships with all of you, but I won't be your crisis manager anymore. My mother picked up her purse with sharp, angry movements that telegraphed her displeasure. Fine. If that's how you want it, Rebecca, then that's how it will be. But don't expect us to just welcome you back with open arms when you decide you're ready to be part of this family again. Don't expect everything to be the same when you're finally done with this selfish phase you're going through. The fact that she still saw my boundary setting as a phase told me everything I needed to know about her capacity to understand what had happened between us, even after accidentally revealing the deliberate nature of my family's exploitation. Even after hearing me clearly explain how their treatment had affected me, she still believed this was temporary rebellion that would eventually end with my return to the role they had assigned me. I understand, I said, walking her to the door. And I'm prepared for things to be different. After she left, I sat in my apartment feeling a strange combination of grief and relief. Grief for the family relationships I had always hoped we could have, and relief that I finally understood why those relationships had never been possible. For the first time in my life, I was standing completely in my own truth, and it felt like coming home. The silence after my mother's accidental confession stretched between us like a chasm that had always existed but was finally visible. I could see her mind working, trying to find a way to reframe what she had revealed, to spin it back into something that sounded reasonable and loving instead of manipulative and exploitative. But the truth was out now, and there was no putting it back. For the first time in my adult life, I felt completely clear about where I stood. The confusion that had plagued me for years, the constant self-doubt about whether I was being too sensitive, too dramatic, too selfish, evaporated in the face of this stark admission. My family had deliberately positioned me as their emotional caretaker because they found it convenient, not because they valued me as a person. Mom, I said, my voice steadier than I had expected it to be, I need you to understand something. I'm not coming back to that role. I'm not going to be the family's crisis manager anymore. And I'm not going to accept being blamed for problems I didn't create. She looked up at me sharply, apparently surprised by the firmness in my tone. Rebecca, I think you're overreacting to what I said. I was just trying to explain. You were explaining perfectly, I interrupted gently but firmly. You were explaining that my family has spent years using me as an emotional support system while giving me nothing in return. You were explaining that you've deliberately overloaded me with responsibilities because you decided I was strong enough to handle everyone else's problems on top of my own. My mother's face began to flush with the kind of anger I recognized from childhood, the anger that appeared whenever someone challenged the family's established order. That's not what I said, and you know it. I said we relied on you because you're capable and responsible. There's nothing wrong with families depending on each other. There's everything wrong with families depending on one person to solve everyone else's problems, I replied. Healthy families don't designate one member to absorb all the dysfunction and blame. Healthy families don't exploit one person's sense of obligation to avoid dealing with their own issues. She stood up abruptly, her posture shifting into the defensive stance I remembered from every argument we'd ever had. So what are you saying, Rebecca? That your family doesn't deserve your help? That we should all just figure out our problems on our own, while you live your perfect little life without any responsibilities to the people who raised you? The manipulation in her words was so familiar that I almost fell back into my old pattern of apologizing and explaining myself. But something had fundamentally shifted in me during our conversation. I could see the manipulation for what it was now, a desperate attempt to guilt me back into a role that had been slowly destroying me for years. I'm saying that my help was never appreciated because it was expected, I said calmly. I'm saying that you turned my love for my family into a weapon against my own well-being. And I'm saying that I won't accept being treated as less than human anymore. Less than human, she repeated, her voice rising. How is being valued for your strengths being treated as less than human? How is being trusted with important family matters being devalued? Because my feelings never mattered, I said, the words coming out with a clarity that surprised me. Because my needs were never considered. Because when I was struggling, you told me I was strong enough to handle it alone. Because when I succeeded, you told me to hide my achievements so other people wouldn't feel bad. Because I was never allowed to be a whole person with my own problems and dreams and limitations. My mother stared at me as if I was speaking a foreign language. Everyone has limitations, Rebecca. Everyone has problems. But some people handle them better than others, and there's nothing wrong with acknowledging that. There's everything wrong with using that acknowledgement as an excuse to pile more problems onto someone who's already carrying too much, I replied. There's everything wrong with deciding that because someone appears strong, they don't need support or care or consideration. She shook her head vigorously, clearly frustrated by my refusal to accept her logic. You're making this much more complicated than it needs to be. Families help each other. That's what we do. If you don't want to help your family anymore, just say so. But don't try to make us the villains for expecting you to care about the people who love you. The casual reframing of exploitation as love was perhaps the most revealing part of our entire conversation. In her mind, using me as an emotional dumping ground was evidence of their affection, not their dysfunction. My refusal to continue in that role was proof of my selfishness, not my self-preservation. I do care about my family, I said quietly. I care enough to stop enabling the dysfunction that's been hurting all of us for years. I care enough to refuse to participate in a system that prevents anyone from growing or healing or taking responsibility for their own lives. So this is it? She asked, her voice taking on the cold tone that meant she was done trying to convince me and was moving into punishment mode. You're just going to abandon us. You're going to let your brother destroy himself and your sister struggle alone and your parents figure everything out. Without any help from the one person who's actually capable of helping. The threats were exactly what I had expected, but they didn't have the power over me that they once had. I could see them for what they were, last-ditch attempts to guilt me back into compliance by making me responsible for outcomes I couldn't control. I'm going to stop taking responsibility for problems that belong to other adults, I said. Jake's addiction is Jake's responsibility to manage, with appropriate professional help. Emma's career struggles are Emma's responsibility to address. Your financial problems are yours to solve. I'll be happy to have healthy relationships with all of you, but I won't be your crisis manager anymore. My mother picked up her purse with sharp, angry movements that telegraphed her displeasure. Fine, if that's how you want it, Rebecca, then that's how it will be. But don't expect us to just welcome you back with open arms when you decide you're ready to be part of this family again. Don't expect everything to be the same when you're finally done with this selfish phase you're going through. The fact that she still saw my boundary setting as a phase told me everything. I needed to know about her capacity to understand what had happened between us. Even after accidentally revealing the deliberate nature of my family's exploitation. Even after hearing me clearly explain how their treatment had affected me. She still believed this was temporary rebellion that would eventually end with my return to the role they had assigned me. I understand, I said, walking her to the door. And I'm prepared for things to be different. After she left, I sat in my apartment feeling a strange combination of grief and relief. Grief for the family relationships I had always hoped we could have, and relief that I finally understood why those relationships had never been possible. For the first time in my life, I was standing completely in my own truth, and it felt like coming home.